You ever wonder why politicians get so fired up about taxes and government spending? Or why you hear these intense arguments about free markets versus more regulation? Well, those aren't just random talking points. They are the echoes of a massive intellectual battle, a clash of ideas that has totally shaped the world we live in today.
And it all boils down to this one huge question. What's the best way to create a prosperous society? Should the government be in the driver's seat, or should we let free markets run the show? Today, we are diving deep into that epic showdown of ideas.
In one corner, you've got the reigning champion of the time, Keynesianism. This was the set of ideas that pretty much ran the world after World War II. And in the other corner, you have the radical challenger, the Chicago School, this rebellious group of thinkers who basically questioned everything the establishment believed.
And this intellectual firestorm didn't start in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. Nope, it started right here, in the classrooms and lecture halls of the University of Chicago. This place became the epicenter for a whole new way of thinking about how the economy works.
Okay, so to really get this rebellion, first you have to understand the king they were trying to overthrow. And in the world of mid-20th century economics, the undisputed king was the brilliant British economist John Maynard Keynes.
See, after the sheer disaster of the Great Depression, Keynes's ideas became the playbook. His main point was, look, markets aren't perfect. They can go off the rails. And when they do, the government has to step in and fix things. And what were the tools? Well, government spending and taxes, using them to fight unemployment and keep the whole system from crashing.
But not everyone was on board with this. A totally different way of thinking started bubbling up, a counter-movement that was about to challenge the very core of Keynesian economics. And this, my friends, was the Chicago Rebellion.
And you really couldn't have picked a better place for this to happen. The University of Chicago was miles away, both literally and figuratively, from the D.C. political bubble. The whole culture there was about fierce, nonstop debate. They saw economics as a hard science, and they were ready to put every single dominant theory under the microscope and see if it held up.
And every rebellion needs a leader, right? Well, this one had Milton Friedman. The man was brilliant, incredibly witty, and an absolute master at debating. He basically dedicated his entire career to taking on the Keynesian establishment and arguing passionately for the power of the free market.
So what was Friedman's plan? How do you take on an idea that's dominated the world for decades? Well, he and his colleagues at the Chicago School went right for the core assumptions of Keynesianism, and they started with a really basic question. Why do we spend money the way we do?
The Keynesian view was pretty intuitive. Our spending is tied to the money we have right now. You get a raise, you spend more. You lose your job, you spend less. Makes sense, right? But Friedman came in with this totally radical idea called the permanent income hypothesis. He said, hold on a minute. We don't just think about today's paycheck. We're smarter than that. We base our spending on what we think we're going to earn over our entire lives.
And this breaks it down perfectly. Let's make it real. Imagine the government sends you a $2,000 check out of the blue. Now you know that's a one-time thing, right? It's not a permanent raise. So what are you going to do? You're probably not going to go out and buy a new car. You're more likely to save it or pay off a credit card bill. Your long-term, your permanent financial picture hasn't really changed. And that was Friedman's big point. It meant that those short-term government stimulus plans, they just weren't the magic bullet Keynesians thought they were. Next, Friedman turned his sights on another huge economic problem, inflation. And this is where he dropped one of the most famous and most controversial lines in the history of economics. He argued that inflation really only has one main cause. Now, his theory sounds a little intimidating, the quantity theory of money, but the core idea is actually really simple. He said if the government just keeps printing more and more money, but the amount of stuff we can actually buy doesn't increase, well, you end up with too much money chasing too few goods. And what happens then? Prices have to go up. So for Friedman, the villain behind inflation wasn't big companies or labor unions, it was central banks printing too much cash.
Okay, but this created a problem for the old way of thinking. For years, Keynesian economists lived by something called the Phillips curve. The basic idea was that there was this stable, predictable trade-off. You could accept a little more inflation, and in return, you'd get lower unemployment. It was like a knob you could turn. But Friedman looked at this and asked a really powerful question. Is that trade-off actually real in the long run?
And his answer was a clear, resounding no. He argued that, sure, you might get a short-term boost, but in the long run, that trade-off completely vanishes. He said the long-run Phillips curve is vertical, which is just a fancy economist's way of saying you can't buy yourself permanently lower unemployment just by printing more money and letting inflation run high.
And this led him to a truly groundbreaking concept,
the natural rate of unemployment. This is the idea that there's a baseline level of unemployment that's just baked into the real structure of the economy, things like technology and people's skills. And his warning was crystal clear. If the government keeps trying to use stimulus to force unemployment below this natural level, all you're going to get for your trouble is more and more inflation without any real lasting gains in jobs.
Now, for decades, Friedman was kind of seen as this voice out in the wilderness. His ideas were radical, way on the fringes of economics. But then the 1970s happened, and the 70s were like an economic disaster movie that changed absolutely everything.
And the monster in this movie had a name: stagflation. It was an absolute nightmare. You had high unemployment and stagnant growth, but at the exact same time, prices for everything were just soaring. This was the 1-2 punch that Keynesian economics just couldn't explain. I mean, according to the Phillips curve, this wasn't even supposed to be possible.
Policymakers were completely trapped. If they tried to fight unemployment with more government spending, they knew it would just make inflation worse. But if they tried to fight inflation by slowing the economy down, unemployment would shoot even higher. It was a total no-win scenario. The old economic playbook was failing, miserably, and suddenly, people started to listen, really listen, to Milton Friedman.
The stagflation of the 1970s wasn't just a crisis, it was the tipping point. Friedman's ideas shot from the fringe right into the mainstream, deeply influencing world leaders like Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and completely reshaping economic policy for decades.
So, what's the final verdict on the Chicago School? Well, it's complicated. On one side, a lot of its core ideas, like the natural rate of unemployment and the critical importance of monetary policy, are now just standard parts of every economist's toolkit. But on the other side, critics point out that the Chicago School's focus on free markets and deregulation might have contributed to financial crises and a massive rise in economic inequality.
And that brings us right back to where we started. That big battle of ideas between Keynes and Friedman, between government action and free markets. It is far from over. It's playing out right now in our debates about healthcare, climate change, and the future of our economy. So the big question isn't just for economists anymore, it's for all of us. When you look at the world today, where do you stand?